Let's come to the presentation, which is number 31 in this year of the Parayana. We've been building by accrual of layers, and the layers are laminations of events in time. So that it's important for us to realize that it isn't like glued layers that make temporal lamination, but the laminar flow is what occurs in time. So that time as an energy has this laminar flow that makes possible not only us, but the universe itself. And that the universe is an occurrence almost as large as it can be and growing, because the laminar flow of time is continuous. It is a continuum. What blossoms out of time are the dimensions of space. And that triad, that tripod of space has form. Time as an energy laminar flow does not need to have existence, but it has occurrence. It occurs. So that energy occurs primordially, spontaneously, out of the zero field vacuum, out of the shunyata. And this time laminar flow continuum, blossoming, has a classic way of being symbolized. And the way that it classically was symbolized about 2,000 years ago is that you had vines that wove and curled and made clusters of grapes, so that the harvesting of those grapes from the true vine that comes blossomed from the laminar flow of time out of the zero field vacuum blessedness of the mystery can be harvested, and one can make wine if you know how to ferment it and take it through that transformation. That is the blood of understanding primordiality into a universe fermented and become a source of vision. A fifth dimension that enfolds the way in which the four dimensions of space-time now, not just time-space, which would be the accurate way of speaking of it, but space-time, which has not only the curves, but is curved. And because space-time is curved, the curves generate gravity. The integral occurs in the energy of time, but the phenomenality of it is in the curvature of space-time. Thus, for Einstein, understanding that the fabric of space-time curves led him to a special theory of relativity, which he refined later on. The one being 1905, the other being in the beginning of the 1920s, and the general theory of relativity is something that is mysterious still was mysterious to Einstein, and that is gravity in the mass as a cosmological constant, as it's come to be called, also has a negative solution, which is just as accurate phenomenally as the positive gravitation, so that there is a quality. We would speak of it generally as negative gravity, but it simply has different ways of being described in modern mathematics, and the mathematics is in quantum field theory. This is the 1992 classic textbook worldwide on quantum field theory, and hopefully next week or so I will bring the 2014 versions of quantum field theory, because there has been in the last week monumental visionary penetrations into that particular mystery. In the notes, presentation notes, for this week's presentation, I have put in the 9 pages from instant little notes of reviewing a video that presents the great mysteries that are now able to be investigated and unfolding. One of the notes begins, the first note begins, Shunyata equals a zero field via negative vacuum energy, synonymous with Einstein's cosmological constant, now read as space has gravity mass. That space has mass makes it dark matter. That the matter that we have been looking at in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum, where the photon interacting with the electron is the way in which one gets a quantum dynamic, QED. Richard Feynman, 1948-49. Now, after about a generation of the refinement of QED to QCD, quantum chromodynamics, now we come to a second transform of QED, which was already genius. The first transform was a fermentation of QED so that you got the wine, Feynman's fine wine. And quantum chromodynamics sought to put in the distillation of that wine into the cognac of QCD. And now we are going to be able to lift in a toast to something which is a third transformation, and that is from the fermentation to the distillation to the real. We are now on the threshold of being able to understand the cosmos, qua cosmos, not the cosmos inferred by a universe, however broad, certain, important we thought that was. It's a threshold where it is incumbent upon us, who are at the vanguard of this threshold, moving out and becoming acclimated not only around the world, but in the species. Our species has been preparing for a long time to have this transform now. This transform beyond the cognac, which was even better than the wine, which was an amazing development from the water and the fruit. We now have an ability to look with compassionate, friendly eyes on vacuum energy, which is time. As space is dark matter, time is dark energy. And that in the cosmos, overwhelmingly, just as dark matter is preponderant over phenomenal electromagnetic matter, the one being about under 5% and the other being close to mid-20s, 24%, together constitute only about a quarter of the cosmos in terms of what is real. That 3/4 is of dark energy or of time. So that time as a first dimension is overwhelmingly, by far, hands down, feet dancing, the source of what is real. So that we have been developing here in this speaker's chair since 2008, when what was offered was the 1-year paired phase transforms, wherein was discovered the time forms of civilization. And since then, over the last 5, almost 6 years, the refinement, it is possible now to see that, in fact, the science, not just the physics or the math, but science as the program of the learning civilization has put it, is the 8th phase, 4 of nature, 4 of consciousness, that coming together make a complementarity 9th. And in the ancient Hermetica, wisely tutored by those alive who still passed on the living words of what they heard, it is important. Those in 9 dimensions hear those in 10 dimensions singing. If you're in 4 dimensions, there's no way you can even imagine a 5th dimension, other than to assign it something magical. Well, it's magic. Well, yes, it is magic. It's very high magic. Is it true? Yes, it's true. It's a dharma, but it's a very high dharma, which keeps extending in its resonances, so that when it enters into those phases from vision, art, and history, making it kaleidoscopic, vision making it differential consciousness, history making it kaleidoscopic consciousness, into science, when all of those as an 8-fold path are seamless in the continuity of time, the complementarity becomes a 9th dimension. And those who are able to course in 9 dimensions for the first time hear those in 10-dimensional hyperspace singing. You can't detect other, quote, life forms in the universe until you have a 9-dimensional continuity that you're in home with. Then you can hear those in the 10th dimension. And what are they singing? They're singing an inclusive chorale that invites us to join. Everything else is a game meant to disrupt and to promote ignorance instead of learning. We've been looking the last 2 months, especially at India, as a case in point in civilization, that just recently the entire history of India has been revolutionized to such an extent that we can't even call it a revolution. We have to use a language which I've been using, a recalibration, which is much stronger than a revolution. A revolution is getting rid of this for another. And the history of such revolutions is that other being subject to symmetry, especially the negative energy that is concomitant with the positive all the time. A revolution will spawn a counter-revolution. We see it today in the news. The revolution replacing the Soviet Union now has a counter-revolution of Russia reinstating the Soviet Union as the Eurasian Empire, Union, etc. The French Revolution had its counter-revolution. It had its Napoleon. You have to understand, and it's imperative to understand, that all of this is well understood now, just not taught, not learned. It's time not to go to school, but to enter into those dimensions of consciousness that allow for learning to mature and for the accumulated penetration to progress. One looks at India and sees that a monumental change came to an India that 500 years before had had a monumental change in the historical Buddha. That the whole structure and ethos of Indian civilization for 1,000 years had been based on the Vedas, had been based on the Aryan invasion of primitive India that had set up the Varnas, the caste system, with the Brahmins at top, defended by the Kshatriya warriors just below, which they were always included in some events, but not in the highest events. And then there were the shopkeepers and the producers, the merchants, and so forth. And then there was the lowest class, the Shudras. And eventually those who didn't even belong in a class, the untouchables. When Gandhi renamed them in the 1920s with his satyagraha, he said, we must not call them untouchables anymore. We must call them, and he used the word in Hindi, Harijan. Harijan means children of God. Hari, Hari Krishna, Harijans. jinns, children of God. Now we are almost a century beyond that, and the wine of Satyagraha became the cognac of Sarvodaya generation or two ago, and now comes the news. Now comes that third transform, time to get real. And that's what's happening here and now. But the now is already a bitter pill of language, because the now connotates always a present moment. And that present moment is a virus, a very deadly virus. It infects and takes away the vitality of the life that time has as one of the star constellations in its dark energy, quote unquote, creativeness. We need to come to a recalibration like India came to 2,000 years ago. The Buddha showed that the Vedas were not the end all. There was a counter-revolution to the development of historical Buddhism. About 1,000 years after the Buddha, there was a movement to have a return in great sophistication to the Vedas. And after about 200, 300 years, there was a mastermind named, his name was Shankaracharya, and he's the one who made the development of the Vedanta, the end excellent product of the Vedas. And in the Vedanta, the hallmark phrase was Tat Avam Asi, thou art that. And when you say it that way, emphatically that way, you can see visually, thou art that. It's an identification. It's an identity. It's like an equation with the equal sign that A equals A. It's a short circuit, logically, mathematically, and it's death to consciousness. In T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, where he is developing one of the great long poems of world poetry, you hear that the thunder said, that last section of The Wasteland, Tat Avam Asi. It's time for there to be a new poetic where that is not the concluding banner of language, however elegant it would have seemed. That's a misleading poetic, strangely enough and oddly enough. You can't hear any singing in any conscious dimensions from there. In between the rise of the counter-revolution of the Vedanta with the appearance of the Buddha, in the middle was the occurrence of the Mahayana, which came as a breath of freshness brought to India under invitation by the man known to history as St. Thomas, who arrived in the southern tip, the west coast of India. Today it's Kerala, the province of Kerala. And he arrived there in 41 AD. As we have said before, he waited until everything that could be done in the Jerusalem area was done, 5 years after the crucifixion, resurrection. And as St. James went to Spain, and with St. Thomas, St. Matthew went to Ethiopia, and St. Thomas went to India, all at the same time, and St. Philip had gone 5 years earlier with the young St. John and Mary Magdalene to Ephesus. And so it left everything then so that the Jerusalem community was in charge of the third James, not St. James, not James the Lesser, but James the Just, one of the brothers of Jesus, who in his lifetime never believed in his brother, believed in having a revision, but not a transformation. And so the Jerusalem left in the hands by James the Just was the beginnings of an odd kind of a tug of war between St. Peter and James the Just, and in the midst of that, many corrupting things occurred. But St. Thomas, when he went to India, he brought with him the freshly written Gospel of Matthew and his own Gospel of Thomas. And when the Gospel of Thomas, that was purposely lost, along with the Gospel of Philip and many, many other books, purposely lost in the mid-300s. Rediscovered in 1945 in Egypt. One of the sayings of the living Jesus was that the foxes have their holes and the birds have their nest, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head and to rest. And the early commentaries to this moment have all been that this is a plea, a plaintive plea to set up places of rest. It's not that at all. That's hearing it in terms of the game, in terms of the political economy business of making control of a phenomenality safe for your kind. It has nothing to do with that at all. These are the words of the living Jesus, unimpaired, which is why these were purposely lost. On that dimensional thrust of an 11-dimensional fertile vacuum, the Son of Man needs no place to lay his head. Distributed cosmically, eternally, are you going to worry about not having a gorgeous fortress on the Tiber with all of the millions? It has nothing whatsoever to do with what is real. It's a part of a game. The disciples said to him, "Thy brethren and thy mother are standing outside." He said to them, "Those here who do the will of my Father, they are my brethren and my mother. These are they who shall enter the kingdom of my Father." It is that quality the misapprehension, even while he was alive, that somehow his family structure, his physical mother, his physical brothers, which later even that was edited out, and his physical sisters, had something to do with him. And very few people were noticing they left out his father. Joseph was not negligible at all. He was the carrier of the time-form inheritance, just like the mother was the carrier of the mitochondrial DNA. It's important to understand that the recalibration is going to be dismissed and then finally criticized and then attempts at being lost, because this is completely different on a dimensional basis. When Thomas ends his sayings of the living Jesus, the last 10 of the sayings, the logoi, logos being the word, logoi, what was said, what we heard. The last 10 are a sequence leading up to the confirmation of shared presence. Not the present, not the now. Those are bear traps that turn even mountain trails, even esoteric paths, into journeys into death and dismemberment, and one has to be very circumspect. The Chinese phrase was "Dieter Schur," which means snake of the place. No one understands a geography better than the snakes who live there, because they go under the ground as well. And their movement is by that kind of mimic of a time energy frequency. And so serpents, characterized as demonic misleaders, are actually protectors, very much so. So that the great Pythian Apollo had his oracle at Delphi protected by that python energy. The historical Buddha was protected by a Naga king, cobra, as he sat under one of, not the Bodhi tree, but 4 Bodhi trees. One of them, the Michelenda tree, there was a lightning storm, and the lightning had possibilities of killing the meditating Siddhartha. And the Naga king wrapped his body 7 times around his body and put the hood over his head to make a lightning rod so that he would be safe in that lightning storm, that thunderstorm. That's what the thunder said. It's in the Mahavamsa, which almost no one reads anymore. It is high time for the high Dharma to be enunciated again, quite clearly. The whole quality can be summed up by a word used by Henri Corbin, a French Islamicist. His History of Islamic Philosophy finally has been translated into English, about almost 500 pages. But his main work is on two thinkers who are always identified with Iran, neither of which was born in Iran. One of them was Avicenna, who was born in Bukhara, which is in Uzbekistan now, but was in ancient Central Asia, not far from where Zarathustra was born. The other was Ibn Arabi, who was born in southern Spain, around Sevilla, in Murcia, and who was the greatest figure in Islam after Muhammad. Born in 1165, when Shetran de Troyes was writing his Arthurian things for the first time, and Heloise and Abelard were, for the first time, being able to set up a learning center called the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit of St. John. He learned that from Mary Magdalene, all about the shared presence of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, which Heloise and Abelard were redoing. And Ibn Arabi was born then, and he lived to 1240. He lived to when Roger Bacon was able, in his beginning maturity, to write these great classics. Imageal is a good word to use for creative imagination. And when we come back from the break, it is creative imagining. It is the imaginal world that is a realm of the poetic. And when you add remembering to it, you get history. That is a dimension that is kaleidoscopically just so. Let's take a break.